Are I am Prakash Rangnath Khade, Department of English, PDVP College, Tasgaon. Today, I am dealing with a topic forms of poetry, particularly sonnet. When we are speaking about poetry, poetry is the form of literature, and literature is the reflection of society, though poetry too reflects the society. When we want to study or when we want to understand the concept of poetry, we must try to understand it on two grounds, such as cognitive ground and aesthetic ground. When we want to study such a poetry on cognitive ground, we firstly try to understand the subject, theme, or content of poetry. Then we must try to know the poet's world view or poet's philosophy. And when we want to it, we must familiar with the ages of poetry. For example, when we are speaking about Elizabethan poetry, Elizabethan poetry is considered as a nest of singing birds. Much poetry must be composed for the purpose of singing. For example, song, sonnet, and ballads. When we are speaking about songs, there is garden in her face. The much concentration on rhyme, rhythm, or metrical composition. Then, when we turn towards metaphysical poetry, meta means here beyond, and physical means here actual world. Poetry must be beyond the perception of common people. One of the example from Go and Catch a Falling Star from John Donne's poetry. It is impossible task to catch a star from falling from the sky. Like this, it is impossible to found a fair lady in this world. And poet says, if you found such a lady, tell me I visit such a pilgrim place. Because such a type of imagination is not available in common people's mind. Even some of the poems refers conceit. The conceit of sense used for lovers. But in actual life, we are not referring such a love with such a religious attitude. Then when we turn towards neoclassical poetry of 18th century, artificiality is the main motto of such a poetry. Artificial language, artificial subjects are chosen for the composition of poetry. Then when we turn towards 19th century romantic poetry, return to nature. Then language of nature, subject taken from the nature, means then when we turn towards Victorian, industrialization is the or mechanism is the main motto of such a period. Means it refers or it reflects the impact of such industrialization or mechanism on the life of human beings. When we turn towards the poetry of 20th century, they think that make it new is main slogan of such era, and their poetry becomes the admixture of the qualities of all back ages. And as per the features of such ages, it make effects on the poetry of poets. Then when we are studying any poetry, we must try to understand the general meaning. Direct and indirect meanings are available in poetry. For example, the road not taken is one of the poem, and in it outwardly when we are looking towards such a poem, it appears that it is about road. But when we are going in depth of such a poem, it is not actually about the roads, it is actually about the ways of life. Or one of the another poem of Arun Kolatkar, Butterfly. Butterfly is the symbol used for Muli. And when we outwardly read such a poem, we think that it is about a butterfly. But actually it is not about a butterfly. It is actually about the life of Muli. Means here cognitive skill plays very important role when we are studying poetry. Then another aspect also very important, which is known as aesthetic skill when we are studying poetry. For example, Wordsworth has given 4 stages of composition of poetry. Means any poet, when compose any poetry, he goes through 4 stages. For example, observation, recollection, contemplation, and composition. and such aesthetic quality plays very important role in fourth stage composition. For example, he firstly, when he observes things from outside world, he firstly select form. Forms such there are many forms of poetry such as song, sonnet, ode, elegy, and ballads. Then, when we are speaking about song, it is metrical composition. Then, ode, it is addressed to a person or a thing, and it is specially written on special occasion. Then, elegy, when we are speaking about elegy, elegy is it must be considered as a mourning song. It expresses the feeling of grief or sorrows on personal or common loss or death. Then when we are speaking about ballad, ballad have no, there is no scope in ballad for trivial subject. It is related to the concept of love, death, supernatural elements. One of the example of supernatural element is the Lady of Shalott. And then when we turn towards another very important form we are going to study as sonnet. When we are speaking about sonnet, it only contains 14 lines. Means when we are studying poetry, we firstly think about the form of the poem. Then structure. Structure indicates how many lines in the poem and it divides into how many stanzas. Then style. Then tone. Tone has given us the idea of theme of the poem. Diction is very important role when we are studying poetry, particularly figures of speech. When we are speaking about Elizabethan poetry of 16th century, figures of speeches like simile, metaphor. For example, my mistress' eyes are not like the sun. Poetry here, William Shakespeare uses the figures of speech simile because there must be comparison between the eyes of mistress and son. In some of the poet uses the figures of speech like hyperbole, personification, and so on. Means here figures of speech plays very important role when we are studying poetry. When we are speaking about the poetry of early 19th century romantic poetry, Wordsworth and Coleridge thinks that poetry, there is no need of artificial language or uncommon language for the composition of poetry. But such a view is not available in 18th century poetry, neoclassical poetry. Then when we turn towards meter, then rhyme scheme. Rhyme scheme also used for particularly songs, sonnets, or ballads because it is composed for the purpose of singing. Now we turn towards our main topic, forms of poetry, particularly sonnet. There are two kinds of sonnets. Italian sonnet, which is also known as Petrarchan sonnet, it is also known as classical sonnet. Such a sonnet form is originated in Italy in 13th century and it is known as sonetto. The word Italian word sonetto is used for sonnet. It is developed by Petrarchan. It is developed by Petrarchan, and that's why the name of Petrarch is given to such a Italian sonnet. Such a sonnet form contains 14 lines and it divided into two stanzas, 8 plus 6. 8 lines are known as octave and it have fixed rhyme scheme such as A B B A A B B A, and then 8 lines are known as sestet. But there is variation in the rhyme scheme, C D E, sometimes C D C D C D. Such a sonnet form brought to England by Sir Thomas Watt and Earl of Surrey, and it is used as it is by some of the English poets like Sir Thomas Watt and Sir Philip Sidney and some others. But Earl of Surrey introduced a sonnet form of 14 lines with 4 stanzas, means here 3 quatrains and a couplet. 4 lines, 3 quatrains and a couplet. But Earl of Surrey is actually known as true father of sonnet. But it is developed much by William Shakespeare and his name is given to such a English sonnet, and English sonnet is known as Shakespearean sonnet. He composed 154 sonnets. 128 sonnets addressed to a fair youth and 28 Sonnets addressed to a dark lady. My mistress' eyes are not like the sun is sonnet number 130. Actually, when we are studying such a poetry, it is not such a dark is such a word dark is not related to color. Actually, it is related to the dark side of a lady. It such a Shakespearean sonnet have a fixed rhyme scheme such as A B A B C D C D E F E F G G. Thank you very much.